With each recent generation, Western media has grown increasingly nostalgic. In terms of music with which I'm most familiar, it seems that from the 50s through the 90s, music was especially oriented toward the future. While it often looked back for inspiration, especially with 70s progressive rock looking to classical music, there was still something fundamentally new about its stylistic developments. With the introduction of new technologies such as drum machines, synthesizers, and computers, the 80s through the 90s were especially focused on discovering the sound of the future, creating sounds that evoked imagery of robots and chrome spacesuits. But it seems to me that there was a shift that started gaining traction in the 2000s, which, instead of simply looking backward for influence on a fundamentally new sound, began to be self-consciously derivative of a certain past time period as an artistic statement in itself. Bands like The Strokes and Interpol derived influence from late 70s and early 80s post-punk music, and others like The Killers, The Bravery, Phoenix, and MGMT in the mid to late 2000s began drawing heavily from 80s synth-pop, which blew up in popularity moving into the 20-teens. Kanye's 808s and Heartbreak also brought this synth-pop influence into the hip-hop world, along with a lyrical focus on, well, heartbreak, resulting in Drake's entire career, among other things. A similar development has occurred across the board in all forms of media, generally following the same time frame. Over the last decade or so especially, nearly every form of media has become dominated by nostalgic references to past subject matter and styles. It has gotten to a point that the film industry is afraid to take the risk of releasing anything that isn't a remake of something from the 80s or 90s, or at least a reference to those IPs. And in the realm of video games, there's been an abundance of Doom clones, side-scrollers, and replications of 90s RPGs, down to the pixel graphics. And companies are capitalizing on nostalgia by re-releasing old games, and even entire game systems. And a common lament that I see in my comments section, aside from all the bugmen trolls, is that games just simply aren't what they used to be. While nostalgia is quite high among millennials, it has only increased even more with Gen Zs. As someone who lies on the border between being a millennial or a Gen Z, depending on how you count it, the younger Gen Zs have made me come to understand the feeling of Gen Xers when they found out that my friends and I were listening to music that had been popular and then gone out of style during their lifetime. It's a pretty strange feeling to see kids walking around looking like they're straight out of a Disney Channel movie from the early 2000s. This analogy is a bit of an overstatement, but it feels kind of like I'm an immigrant from a majority Muslim country who arrived in the United States to find Americans walking around in hijabs for purely stylistic purposes. I was there, and I swear it wasn't that exciting. But they are reappropriating something familiar to me because it feels exotic to them. But why exactly is each generation getting increasingly nostalgic? Why are we increasingly longing for a past that we didn't even experience sometimes? Well, one study found that nostalgia is, quote, triggered by dysphoric states such as negative mood and loneliness. They also found that it, quote, generates positive affect, increases self-esteem, fosters social connectedness, and alleviates existential threat. And this makes a lot of sense. Depression rates have been pretty steadily increasing for decades, which was only accelerated in the last few years by the COVID lockdowns. The average amount of close friendships per person in America has also greatly decreased since 1990. In 1990, 33% of Americans said they had 10-plus close friends, compared to only 13% in 2021. And the amount of people with no close friends has risen from 3 to 12%. Add to this the continual breakdown of the family, and it is no wonder that people are lonely and depressed. Nostalgia is for many people a way out of those feelings. On a natural level, what makes people happy is belonging to a community of shared values and affections, and feeling that they themselves are valuable to that community. And that is precisely the sort of thing that has been continually on the decline in Western society, really for centuries. For pretty much all of human history until recently, you were born already belonging to a community of shared values, and were more or less assigned a role to play. You knew where you belonged and how you personally were expected to make yourself valuable to that community. But three related ideals have arisen in the West, which have gradually eroded our sense of belonging: individualism, egalitarianism, and universalism. And compounding the impact of these ideals are the societal effects of the Industrial Revolution. So in order to understand why we are experiencing loneliness and searching for self-esteem, social connectedness, and the alleviation of existential threat in things as simple as N64 emulation, I believe it is necessary to consider the impact of these developments. And then in part 2 of this video, we will discuss more broadly where we really ought to be looking for the happiness we're searching for in low polygon counts and clunky controls. So first, we have increasingly come to view isolated individuals, rather than households, as the building block of society. It used to be the case that your identity was largely defined by things external to you, and the greatest determining factor was your family. Who you were, first and foremost, was a member of a certain family, and that family generally had one collective trade by which they put bread on the table, as well as one religion that was usually shared by the whole country. And even in older democratic systems, there was not a vote per person, but only a vote per household, and even that was not the case across the board, as it was often only a household of aristocratic status that got a vote. So economically, religiously, and politically, a household was the basic unit of society, and thus you derived your social identity largely from your family. This created both social and economic conditions that incentivized the solidarity of the family. Everyone in the family was dependent on one another for their well-being and participation in the larger community, and thus families were bound more closely together. You were born already part of a family unit, where you had an assigned role economically and socially, and thus did not have to face the modern existential crisis of figuring out who you're going to be, and how you're going to be valuable to others. You already possessed that to a large degree from birth. This is not to say that you had no freedom to find some greater way to contribute to the larger community, independently of your family identity. It was simply the case that you had a far more robust foundational identity, derived from your family, to build on. But in the present day, we define our identity on a purely individualistic basis. Or at least on the surface, we like to think that we do. In theory, our understanding of individual identity is entirely psychological. Your true self is who you are deep down inside, apart from all societal influence. For more on this, check out my video on Rousseau. In reality, though, we end up simply finding different communities to conform our individual values to. In the name of individual autonomy, we break away from our families only to find some other artificial family to replace them, whether it be the LGBTQ+ community, or the subreddit for our favorite intellectual property, or a Discord server. And while the fact that we technically chose the community grants us the illusion of being free individuals, we wind up in the end just conforming ourselves to an alternate, less sufficient community of shared values. The family has essentially been replaced by artificial communities, formed by individual consumer preferences. But because they are not actual family, the natural institution that our desires are designed for, they are not quite fit for the task. So we wind up miserable, isolated, and lonely, and we often don't know why. Secondly, we have become increasingly egalitarian. Egalitarianism is the idea that all people are equal, and that sounds completely moral and unobjectionable on the surface, but the problem is that it simply isn't true, at least not in every sense. As controversial as it is to say, men and women, for instance, are biologically very different. Men are objectively stronger, more prone to abstract thought, more likely to associate upward in society, and more aggressive than women. And women are objectively more nurturing, less volatile, more likely to associate downward in society with children, for instance, and physically weaker than men. It thus makes total sense for men to take on societal roles that involve leadership and physical protection, and for women to take on more nurturing and domestic roles, which is why such has been the case in the vast majority of past societies. We are biologically designed for these distinct roles, and it is only for the sake of pursuing imaginary ideals of equality in a decadent society that we deny this fact. Further, people have different varieties of skills, differing levels of intelligence, and different moral dispositions that make them objectively more or less valuable to society. And what I mean by value, of course, is not a matter of being worthy or unworthy of the protection of law, or being treated with dignity. Any person is worthy of those things. But what I mean is that certain people simply contribute more to society than others, and are thus more deserving of honor. The problem with our modern pushback against all kinds of inequality is that good inequalities are lumped in with bad ones, and thus are rejected outright. Natural inequalities such as IQ or different emphases in the abilities of sexes are not embraced or accounted for, but are instead treated as problems to be solved. But these things are simply facts of nature that cannot be changed, and as long as we try to combat nature by trying to artificially construct an equal outcome for all people in every way, society will continue to suffer as a result. Natural institutions which are designed to account for inequalities in a way that accepts them, while still alleviating their negative results through equal protection of the law, enable people who are exceptional contributors to society to receive more honor, and thus there is a natural system of incentives for those who contribute the most to the common good. Artificial government systems that seek to make all people equal in every way wind up doing the exact opposite. For example, even though rich men often acquire their wealth through unjust means, they are nonetheless the most valuable contributors to the economy, whether we like it or not. Thus, to have disproportionate taxes on the rich and redistribute that wealth to the poor indiscriminately is to punish high achievers and to reward those who contribute little to nothing. Yes, we should help the hard-working poor whose poverty is due to circumstances that are no fault of their own, but that ought not be through punishing those who make the greatest contributions in society. That only rewards laziness and punishes hard work. Because of the modern political measures that seek to destroy all natural inequalities, we have done much to destroy the family values and the work ethic that American society inherited from its Puritan founders. Men are designed to be the leaders of the family and to seek honor in society through exceptional work. But egalitarianism seeks to destroy the traditional male-dominated power structure in both the family and the larger society by demanding diversity, gender equality, and breaking apart the central role of the family. Women are discouraged from staying home to raise their children, and trained to desire the place of man in society. They are thus told that they need to murder their unborn children, or else they'll never be able to fulfill the dreams that society has drilled into their heads. And meanwhile, men are hated by society and discouraged from fulfilling their natural masculine desires of being honored for exceptional work in society, being the protector and provider of their own family and kin, and so forth. To give preference to your own family and relatives is considered discriminatory and nepotistic, and to seek honor for your own exceptional efforts above the less deserving is likewise seen as discriminatory. It is no wonder then that young men are disillusioned, often retreating to the worlds of fiction and video games, where they can live out a fantasy of being exceptional and rewarded for their feats of strength. In the real world, any companies they build for the future of their families will inevitably be infiltrated by foreigners who don't share their values. Any exceptional efforts they make will be treated as equal to the half-assed efforts of others for the sake of equity. Every place where men ought to be able to exercise masculine virtues has had roadblocks installed to hinder their success. They are greatly limited from receiving the self-esteem and sense of value to their communities that would come from their natural giftings as men, because of the artificial equality that is imposed to exalt the less deserving to their same level. And with no way to truly excel, they most often choose to simply find a means of escaping reality, often by hearkening back to simpler times and exploring imaginary worlds through video games. The third destructive principle of modern society is universalism. It is true that the most abstract principles of truth, justice, goodness, and so forth are indeed universal, applying to every man, woman, and child in the same way. But there are also particular ways that these truths apply to each individual in society that are not the same for everyone. It is good, for instance, for a ruler to put a violent criminal to death, but it was not good for that violent criminal to kill a man. This is because the ruler has a position of authority that serves the common good, while the violent criminal serves only his own personal good in violation of the common good. Context matters in how we apply abstract universal principles. Universal principles apply to particular situations in ways that are unique to that particular situation. What is good for one on an abstract level is good for all, but when it gets down to the specific details, what is good for one may in fact be bad for another. But the spirit of the modern age has increasingly tended toward unqualified universalism. What is good for one must always be good for another, or else it cannot be good at all. There can be no particularity. So if it is good for a man to rule his household or a city or a nation or to fight in a war, then these things must also be good for a woman as well. There can be no distinction between genders. Likewise, if it is good for a natural-born Irishman, whose family has lived in Ireland for generations, to decide the affairs of his country, then it must also be good for a Somalian immigrant with a different religion and culture and no generational ties to the land and nation to decide the affairs of Ireland as well. What is good for one must be good for all, or it is no good at all. And this universalist principle is carried out at an international level, with the global American empire taking over every country they can and installing their own democratic government that will allow the construction of McDonald's restaurants, and for sodomites to practice their abominable practices freely and openly. If democracy, fast food, and sodomy are good for us, which are of course each quite debatable statements, then they are good for everyone. In fact, if it's good for everyone, then anything else is injustice for everyone. And if our government is right in ending such injustices on their own soil, what is stopping them from ending those injustices everywhere else on Earth? What is right for one is right for all. Hence, the global American empire, or the GAE, the gay, must be established from sea to sea. Because of this modern outlook, none of us can have anything particular to ourselves. Nothing can be particularly dear to us, because that would mean we are claiming it for ourselves to the exclusion of others. We cannot love our nation above all other nations, since that would mean we are wicked, xenophobic, white nationalists. We cannot love our ethnic and cultural heritage above all others, because that would mean we are vile, racist, white supremacists. We cannot believe that our religion is true above all others, because that would make us close-minded, conceited, judgmental fundamentalists. Everything must belong to everyone, or else it cannot belong to anyone. This is the underlying principle behind the woke, utopian ideal of, quote, inclusivity. There can be no particularity. Their supposed principle of diversity only applies when it involves eliminating the particularity of Western culture, in order to conform it to one homogeneous global culture where we will own nothing, and we will be happy. Nostalgia is a fitting response to this on a psychological level. An important part of celebrating societal particularity, after all, is collective memory. Whereas new video game releases are for everyone, games from my childhood are mine. Built into the experience of vintage media is a particularity that can only be gained through time, memories of a past time that are experienced once again when you boot up an old game system. In a world where everything belongs to everyone, and does all it can to especially include all outsiders, it is refreshing to experience something that belongs to me. Now, all of these problems, the isolation caused by individualism, the breakdown of the family and distinct societal roles through egalitarianism, and the loss of particularity through universalism, have all reached absolutely unprecedented levels with the aid of technological advances that have occurred since the Industrial Revolution. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, individuals were extremely dependent on their families and local communities for all the necessities of life. Everything from information to food came directly from someone else in your own family or local community. If you wanted to know why the sky is blue, you could not Google it. If you were not literate or did not have a book on the topic, you had to physically travel to someone who knew the answer, and the question had to be important enough to warrant such travel, or else you would simply give up and not find it out. You were dependent on those closest in physical proximity to you for nearly all the information you knew, and it was the same concerning everything in your everyday experience. Everything you knew and experienced and loved and hated was shared in common with your local community. You ate the same food, listened to the same music, read the same literature, worshipped the same God, leisured in the same countryside, knew all the same people, dressed in the same clothes, had the same ancestors, and shared the same experiences with the people who live next door to you. These natural commonalities meant that you were inevitably close to your family and local community, and had a bond of shared affections, customs, and memories that bound you together. While there were certainly people who were comparatively more individualistic than others, certain societies that were more egalitarian than others, and people who valued particularity less than others, the physical realities and necessities of the pre-industrial era prevented anyone from being completely isolated from the common experiences and customs of their families and local communities. But in the last few centuries, technology has advanced faster than it ever has before, and the advances have removed these former constraints that bound local communities together. The world shrunk dramatically when the fastest mode of travel went from the 20 miles per hour of horseback to the 575 miles per hour of a passenger plane, and the fastest mode of distant communication went from the days, weeks, months, or even years it takes to deliver a letter to the instant delivery of a text message to anywhere across the world. While this has, in some sense, brought the world closer together on a global scale, it has simultaneously torn the world apart at a local level. And with the vast, unfathomable wealth of information that is at our fingertips, we are all accessing separate opinions, information, music, films, and literature from our family members and neighbors. This has created a situation where every natural local community has completely isolated experiences, opinions, knowledge, interests, and preferences. Communities are primarily bound together by shared loves and experiences, and those things now all develop at an almost exclusively individual level through the internet. There are now very few natural communities of shared values. We have little in common with the person who lives next door to us because every individual's values have been entirely shaped immediately by the massive global information dump of the internet. Even just thinking back a small handful of decades, compare our current highly fractured culture to the relative cultural consensus of even the 1970s. If you were a teenager that was into music, you had a much smaller pool of records to choose from that was largely the same as those you interacted with in your local community, who all shopped at the same local record store. So while all the normies were listening to disco, you might be into Pink Floyd and David Bowie, and all the other kids who were into music with a bit more depth were also into Pink Floyd and David Bowie because that's what was widely available. So those with similar interests also had similar tastes to one another, and thus they were bound together with shared values and experiences. But with the internet, the pool of available music is nearly infinite, and when you get below the globally popular artists like Taylor Swift or Drake or whoever, everyone is listening to something entirely different. There are far less defining artists of a generation. Everyone is listening to something different because the pool is so big and independently accessed. I personally knew of only 1 or 2 people at my high school, of thousands of kids, who had even heard of any of my favorite bands, despite knowing many who were just as passionate about music as myself. As a result, I could only speak to strangers on the internet about my chief interests at the time, despite many other kids at my school who in a past generation would have had an abundance of commonalities with myself. This is because when everyone is having their tastes shaped by their own isolated experiences on the internet, they come to lack commonalities with those who are physically close to them. Further, technological advances have moved the center of social and economic activity out of the household and town square into the international pool of digital information. One's vocation or career is far more isolated, not being something held in common by a family as a crucial part of a community, but most often is only work you perform as an isolated individual for a faceless corporation in which you have no stake. Again, the communal aspect and sense of value to others has been almost entirely diminished. There's very little sense of pride that comes from most people's work, no sense that one has an important role in one's community by performing their work with excellence. Nostalgic media alleviates the negative feelings of modern society's isolation in a couple of ways. First, it calls back to a time when our own culture was more homogeneous, and thus had more of a consensus in its judgments concerning media. This is bolstered by the even greater consensus we perceive in that time period based on the way that opinions are settled about particular creative works over time. This creates an illusion that things were even more homogeneous at that time due to the way that consensus forms about particular works decades later. Thus, because there is more of a consensus about games, music, or films in the past generations, and that consensus has only increased exponentially in the present due to retrospective analysis, we can more easily find others who share our appreciation for particular media. We are consequently drawn to these works because in them we find a community of shared values that is not present in modern releases. In other words, more people have a stronger appreciation for older forms of media, and therefore interest in them is far more capable of forming bonds between people than newer forms of media. Therefore, people are drawn to them, even if only subconsciously, because of their natural desire for community formed by shared values. Secondly, nostalgic media similarly fulfills, to some degree, the natural desire for a community of shared experiences and memories formed by their people's common history. It is a natural part of human communities to treat their collective memories as sacred, and to reenact past experiences which its individuals may not have even lived through themselves. And they do this through memorial feasts or rituals most often. The Israelites, for instance, ate the Passover meal in memory of the original Passover lamb that their ancestors ate when they were delivered from Egypt. Through this meal, they reenact the events of their ancestors as an act of communal solidarity and common identity with past generations. Americans do the same thing on Thanksgiving when we reenact the mythical meal of the Pilgrims, who feasted on turkey in their newly settled land, with their buckled hats and rifles at their sides. This phenomenon closely parallels the way that people treat media from the past. People find nostalgic comfort in emulating styles or enjoying media from a past generation, even if they themselves did not live through that generation. It fulfills a certain comforting desire for belonging in us to participate in the experiences of past generations. And this desire is fulfilled all the more when we can share these nostalgic experiences with others in the present, sharing our appreciation for past video games or music with others who are also experiencing them now. There is simply a sense of comfort and belonging that comes from participating in past experiences, and this is an intended natural way of finding solace in a community. But while nostalgia alleviates our natural desire for the comfort of belonging to a certain degree, it is certainly not a replacement. Our natural desires are created to be fulfilled by a particular thing, and any replacement will not be entirely sufficient. For instance, the grumbling of our bellies is created to tell us that we need food, and while we can curb our hunger temporarily by chewing gum or some other distraction, we will eventually have to eat to fully satisfy the desire. When we immerse ourselves in nostalgia, it is a distraction and not a solution. We derive partial fulfillment by engaging in one isolated element of the pleasure of belonging to a natural community, but we do not receive the full thing for which our desire exists in the first place. In the end, the rise of nostalgia is just one part of our generation's search for happiness. We are not happy, and we want to be quite badly. So how in the world can we be happy? Part of the solution is to restore what was lost. This is of course easier said than done, and will likely take generations to accomplish. We cannot truly be happy on a natural level unless we have the things our natural desires were created for. And if our only hope for happiness is found in things that will take generations of hard work and the overcoming of many odds, then happiness is impossible. So this raises the question, can we have our natural desires unfulfilled and still be happy? Or more broadly, how can we ultimately be happy in the first place? Yeah, this isn't as fun as I remembered. What the hell is that? In order to answer the question of how one can be happy, it is first necessary to figure out what exactly happiness is in the first place. When modern people talk about happiness, we are referring to an internal emotional state of pleasure or contentment. But this internal state has not always been identified in itself with happiness. For Aristotle, happiness referred more so to an external state. The Greek word he uses that is often translated happiness is eudaimonia. It literally means the good spirit, or it could also be translated well-being or the good life. According to Aristotle, happiness does not merely consist of a contented mental state, but rather of an all-around, well-ordered, and abundant life. It's essentially life lived to its fullest. And by this he did not mean the same thing that is meant by millennials when they sell their house to live in a van and travel the countryside, in an attempt to live life to its fullest through constant new and exciting experiences. Rather, Aristotle had teleology in mind. Teleology refers to ends or purposes. Everything in existence has a particular end or purpose for which it exists. The end of an acorn, for instance, is to grow into a tree. And the end of a human, according to Aristotle, is to achieve eudaimonia, or happiness, to live the good life. He considered 3 goods to be necessary for happiness: bodily goods, like health and pleasure; external goods, like food and shelter; and goods of the soul, like friendship, love, knowledge, skill, and honor. And what is necessary to attain these goods is virtue. Now, we might understand virtue as being primarily ethical in nature, but that is only moral virtue. The word virtue, or arete in Greek, more generally means excellence, and individual virtues are particular excellences or habits of excellence. These habits include both intellectual and moral virtues. It is by practicing these habits of excellence that men can attain the goods necessary for happiness. So, for Aristotle, happiness is a full life filled with bodily, external, and soul goods, which are obtained by fostering habits of intellectual and moral excellence, and all of this ordered by reason. Now, this last part, ordered by reason, is crucial. This relates again to our end or purpose as human beings. Aristotle compared humans to other creatures and considered what distinguishes us from them. He concluded that it is our capacity for reason. This factor, which makes humanity unique, he determined, was central to our purpose. It is in fact a quality that makes us like the gods, and the gods themselves live in a state of perpetual blessedness and happiness, and therefore to engage in the activity with which the gods are continually engaged is true ultimate happiness, our highest end. And that ultimate end is contemplation, or the active meditation upon things eternal and divine. This understanding of happiness quite closely parallels the understanding presented in the Old Testament centuries before Aristotle. The book of the Psalms opens with the statement, "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night." The word for blessed here in Hebrew is asher, which literally means straight, level, or right, as in being set straight and level, with everything properly set right and in order. It is life well ordered and happy, the good life. And the means of achieving this blessed state is, like with Aristotle, the fostering of habits of intellectual and moral excellence. The blessed man does not associate with evil men, but instead engages in divine contemplation through the habit of meditation upon the law of the Lord, day and night. Blessedness in the Old Testament likewise includes the goods mentioned by Aristotle. In Deuteronomy, Moses lists the blessings that accompany obedience to his law, which include each of Aristotle's forms of necessary goods for the happy life. For faithfulness to the Lord, the Israelites would have fruitful land and fruitful wombs, and they would be raised in strength and influence above the nations around them. And most importantly, they would be the people of the Lord, and he would be their God, with his glory dwelling among them. But the way this worked was not in a mechanical one-to-one manner, as if each morally virtuous act was immediately rewarded with prosperity, and each evil act was immediately punished with poverty. This is a general rule for how God would act, and each blessing would come about over time, but this did not rule out the ability for evil men to persecute the righteous, or for unexpected disaster to occur for the righteous and unrighteous alike. This is precisely the point of the book of Job, which is about a righteous man whom the Lord tests by allowing Satan to take away all of his bodily and external goods, leaving him in a state that looked like that of a cursed, unrighteous man to all his friends, despite having truly been righteous. The point of this test was not just for Job's sake, but also for the sake of the generations after who would read about his life. Job was stripped of all the external blessings that would normally be granted to a virtuous man, so that only that which is truly essential to ultimate happiness would remain and be made more apparent. Job is continually tempted to curse the Lord and die, but he remains faithful through all his suffering, and toward the end of the book he declares his true hope for happiness. Quote, "For I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has thus been destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God." Once again, we see that while we have many natural necessities for happiness that can be taken away from us by unforeseen circumstances which are outside of our control, our ultimate end, our ultimate means of happiness, is contemplation, to look upon the eternal God. And in the end, even if we have all the necessities of life, We cannot truly achieve lasting happiness unless we acquire this end of all ends, the central purpose of human life, that all other lesser purposes point to. As St. Augustine writes, speaking to God, quote, "You have formed us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." This vision of God, the ultimate end of humanity, is referred to by theologians as the beatific vision, or the vision that makes one happy. The beatific vision is that which is described by Job in the quote mentioned earlier. It is the final vision of God which cannot be fully acquired during this life, but which he receives after death when his body is restored in the resurrection, and he dwells with God on earth for eternity. The Gospel of John says that no one has ever seen God, and in Exodus 33:20 the Lord says, "No one may see me and live." While men certainly do see partial visions of God in the Bible, they can never see his full glory and survive. This is because only perfect beings, fully mature, holy, and unstained by sin, can withstand the sight of his overwhelming glory. But Job says that in the resurrection, when he receives a perfect body no longer stained by sin, he will finally be able to look upon the glory of God. This is the hope he possessed of true lasting happiness, even when all sources of natural happiness had been stripped from him. Concerning the vision of those with faith in Christ in this life, the Apostle Paul says, "For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face." The glory of the Lord has been revealed to us in perfect men, and we can look upon him, though our vision is dim, as we only look through the eyes of faith. But when Christ returns at the end of this age, the Apostle Paul says, "We shall be like him, because we shall see him as he is." In other words, just as Christ, the Son of God, took on flesh like ours, and became the perfect man, so when he returns revealing his full glory, we will be made perfect men like him, and thus enabled to withstand seeing the full brightness of his glory, face to face. It is this vision on the last day, and for all eternity after, that is man's ultimate happiness. And through faith in Christ, we can presently contemplate this vision of God, despite how dim it appears now in our present state of imperfection. As the author of the book of Hebrews says, "Strive for the holiness without which no one will see God." The way to pursue this ultimate happiness in this life is to seek to increase our holiness. The more we increase in holiness in this life, the clearer our vision of God's glory will become, and thus the greater our spiritual experience of joy. Now this all might seem like I am saying that the key to happiness is to withdraw from life, become a monk, and spend your days praying in a desert somewhere. And maybe that would be good for some of you terminally online folks. But what I'm saying is actually quite the opposite. This is because once you have set your sights on your final goal, everything on the way there comes into perspective. Your relationships, career, hobbies, politics, all have a natural end. But beyond that is the higher end to which all things point, the glory of God. As St. Paul says, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God. So the key to happiness is not total withdrawal, but an ordering of all the activity of our present life toward our final enjoyment of God's glory. The holiness without which no one will see God is a holiness lived out in everyday life, in which we set all things on earth in order, according to God's will. We are to pray, "Your will be done on earth as in heaven," and live our lives in a way that accomplishes this end the best we can, in every area of our lives. It is true that there's a certain temporal happiness that we can't have in the current state of the world. The state of our society that I described in part 1 is truly something to lament, and to do everything in our power to change. We ought to seek to restore the strength of the family. We ought to seek to eliminate our society's replacement of meritocracy with mediocrity. We ought to seek to create a society where people feel a sense of belonging, and can truly say with pride, "My people" and "my nation" again, and where Christian morality takes its place once again in the public sphere, where the values of the woke trash world have presently dethroned it. But this will take generations, and unless we have our minds set on eternity, we will only live for ourselves and for the here and now. And unless we have the joy of fellowship with God in the present, and the hope of the fullness of that joy in the future, we will not have the strength to endure as we work for a better future for our children. So if you want to be happy, here's what I recommend you do. 1. if you do not believe in Jesus Christ, then repent of your sins and believe that Christ died, was buried, rose again from the grave, and is reigning from heaven at the right hand of God the Father. He died so that you can live. Trust in him and live. 2. If you already believe, recall that virtues are habits. You must develop habits of excellence in every area of life, and that begins with developing the habit of meditating on the Word of God day and night. At least once a day, you should spend time reading the Bible and in prayer. This does not simply mean reading the Bible as you would any other work of literature, though of course it doesn't mean less than that, but you should read prayerfully in an effort to truly know and experience God. If you need help understanding it, as you definitely will if this is your first time, consult commentaries, and with that, my only advice here is, the older the better. I'll also put a link to a video on how to read the Bible from my other channel in the description. 3. In addition to this, and guided by what you learn in Scripture, work to develop habits of excellence in pursuit of both your earthly as well as your heavenly purpose. Seek to glorify God in all areas of your life, being a hard worker and excelling in your work, developing skills that bring satisfaction to yourself and others. Being self-controlled, not just weakly submitting to every desire of your body. Thinking less of yourself and more of others, considering others more important than yourself. Being patient with others and with your circumstances. Not having a high time preference, but waiting for things to come to you in time. Find a girl, ask her name, and then marry her, and be 100% faithful to her all your life. Love God and others with all your strength, and be kind, not as our woke culture understands kindness, but being generous and compassionate to those who genuinely need it. In short, live life to its fullest. Be fully human, in the sense in which to be a man is to be an image of God. And 4th and finally, through these virtues, pursue the things that make for a full life. Seek the good of your body, being healthy, increasing your physical strength, and enjoying the pleasures of this life, in moderation, of course. Seek external goods like wealth, a nice home, delicious food, and so forth. And seek above all these others, the goods of the soul, by forming strong friendships, finding love, enjoying beauty in art and music, and gaining honor among your peers. These things are all good and bring happiness in this life. But be careful not to pursue them as final ends, but only as things to be enjoyed in light of your final end of contemplating God. In place of God, they are empty and can bring no lasting joy, but when pursued and enjoyed to the glory of God, they are blessings given to gladden the heart. Life is certainly full of sadness, and that is not something we can escape, no matter how many times we revisit fond memories from simpler times in the past. But we can be happy in spite of all the sadness around us. If you want to be happy, pursue God, live virtuously, and enjoy the gifts God gives in this life. This is the only way to experience true lasting happiness, in this life and in the next.